Welcome everyone joining us to this public panel on the topic A Century After Debs, hosted by the 18th Annual International Convention of the Platypus Society. My name is Connor and I'll be the moderator of this event. The Platypus Society, established in December 2006 in Chicago, organizes reading groups, public fora, research and journalism focused on the problems and tasks inherited from the old 1920s to 30s, new 1960s to 70s, and post-political 1980s to 90s left, for the possibility of emancipatory politics today. The panel topic for today is A Century After Debs, and the panelists have been asked to respond to the following prompt. Thomas Jefferson would scorn to enter a modern democratic convention. He would have as little business there as Abraham Lincoln would have in a latter-day Republican convention. If they were living today, they would be delegates to this socialist convention. Eugene Debs. Eugene Debs stood at the center of the socialist movement in the United States during the era of the Second International. Like many socialists of the time, he understood the struggle for socialism as both a continuous with and as an overcoming of the wider legacy of the bourgeois revolution. The Socialist Party of America, SPA, rose contemporaneously with other movements which claimed America's revolutionary legacy, such as populism and progressivism. Yet Debs and socialists like him understood these movements to be fundamentally opposed to the goals of the proletarian Socialist Party. Yet this Marxist orthodoxy would enter a dual crisis, both from the international revisitor's dispute of the early 1900s and the success of the October Revolution in 1917. The Bolshevik Revolution and the international revolutionary wave of the post-war years appeared to many socialists, including Debs, as a moment of revolutionary possibility for the socialist movement. Yet the subsequent history of socialism in the United States and globally raises the question of whether the split of the SPA and of the global socialist movement was a step forward or a step backwards for socialism. What did Debs mean when he said, "From the crown of my head to the soles of my feet, I am a Bolshevik and proud of it"? What is the relationship between the crisis of the SPA, the rise of progressivism, and the wider crisis of the American Revolution experienced in the aftermath of World War I? How did Debs understand the role of the Socialist Party in the struggle for socialism? What lessons does the life and legacy of Eugene Debs hold for emancipatory politics today? Our format is simple. Each of the three speakers will have around 12 to 15 minutes for opening remarks, then 5 to 7 minutes each, after everyone has spoken, to respond and discuss directly with fellow panelists. Then, after a very short break, that's not right, we'll have an hour or so of audience Q&A. If time permits, we'll also take questions from the online audience, which we don't have. Sorry, this is a model I use. For the Q&A, I hope to only call on questions. If you in the audience have more of a comment, then I encourage you to work into a short piece of writing and submit it to the Platypus Review, where the transcript from this event will be published alongside respective selected responses. Our speakers for today are read out in an agreed upon speaking order. Mark Burrows has served as the organizer and co-chair for the RWU. He retired at the end of 2015 after hiring out in 1974, working as an engineer for a combined total of 34 years at the C&NW and Soo Line CP Rail in Chicago, Illinois. He was Smart TV's 1433 delegate for the 2011 and 2014 international conventions and continues to be an active member of the RWU. Dr. Carlos L. Garrido is a Cuban-American professor of philosophy who received his master's and PhD from the Southern Illinois University of Carbondale. He serves as the Secretary of Education for the American Communist Party and as the director of the Midwestern Marx Institute, the largest Marxist-Leninist think tank in the United States. He also writes short-form articles for his Substack at Philosophy in Crisis and does regular YouTube programs for the Midwestern Marx Institute channel. He is on Instagram at Carlos L. Garrido with dots in between. Andrea Bauer, born in Elgin, Illinois, moved to Seattle in 1980. She is the National Secretary of the Freedom Socialist Party at its headquarters there and also writes and edits for the party's newspaper, The Freedom Socialist. Ed Remus is a member of the Platypus Society. His interview with David Walters, co-editor of the selected works of Eugene V. Debs, was published in the July 2020 issue of the Platypus Review. His bibliographic essay, The Historiography of Debsian Socialism, A Century of Interpretations, was published in Choice magazine in 2022. His 2023 teaching, titled Debsian Socialism in the Rearview Mirror, is available on the Platypus YouTube channel. The event will conclude at 4:30 at the latest, after which we plan to take a break for our penultimate panel of the convention, How Does Marxism Matter in the 21st Century, at 5:30.
Ultimate panel. What was it letter?
Isn't penultimate ultimate like the final?
It's the second to last.
The ultimate panel. With that, I hand it over to Mark, who will begin his opening remarks.
That was actually, I worked 37 years total. And I'm also Railroad Workers United representative on the Eugene Debs Foundation Board of Directors. So I want to start by clarifying most of what I will be expressing here are my personal opinions as opposed to representing Railroad Workers United. That said, I'd like to start by saying a little bit about RWU and our continuity with Debs, the rail labor organizer, and then from there I'll get into my own personal opinions about Debs, the revolutionary socialist, and his importance and relevance for today's fighters. A quote from our quarterly newsletter, The Highball. Anybody? I have a few with me here. RWU was organized in April 2008 at a founding convention in Dearborn, Michigan. RWU grew out of decades of struggle within the craft unions for unity, solidarity, and democracy. We are carrying on a tradition of rank and file activity which dates back to the 1890s and the time of Eugene V. Debs. Our statement of principles can be summed up: unity of all rail crafts, an end to inter-union conflict, rank and file democracy, membership participation and action, solidarity among all railroaders, no to concessionary bargaining. We are fighting to strengthen our respective unions and challenge them to act in unity as one entity in order to more effectively fight for dignified and safe working conditions which impact the general public as well, with the tragedy in East Palestine, Ohio a few years ago, the poster child for that concept. In essence, we're attempting to pick up where the American Railway Union left off. The same issues and struggles that compelled Debs and fellow rail union leaders and activists to found the American Railway Union in 1893 unfortunately still exist today. Debs saw back then how the carriers played one craft union against the other, the simple game of divide and conquer. And the rail carriers have continued to play that game with the unionist leadership being willing participants by accepting the archaic individual craft union structure. Unity within each craft, solidarity with the other crafts, and internal democracy within each union. Not only are these the slogans of RWU, it's not only what we need within the labor movement as a whole, but ultimately that sums up what Debs stood for and what we as socialists stand for: a society and a world guided by the principles of unity, solidarity, and democracy. I'm going to assume most, if not all of you, know the basic history of the Pullman strike. So for the sake of time, I'm going to fast forward past that. In 1902, Debs wrote an essay titled "How I Became a Socialist." In it, he eloquently describes his transformation both in the heat of battle as well as his reflections during his 6 months in Woodstock County Jail. Referencing how the strike was being won, on the ground he wrote, quote, "At this juncture, there were delivered from wholly unexpected quarters a swift succession of blows that blinded me for an instant and then opened wide my eyes. And in the gleam of every bayonet and the flash of every rifle, the class struggle was revealed. This was my first practical lesson in socialism, though wholly unaware that it was called by that name," unquote. He goes on to say, quote, "The Chicago jail sentences were followed by 6 months at Woodstock, and it was here that socialism gradually laid hold of me in its own irresistible fashion. Books and pamphlets and letters from socialists came by every mail, and I began to read and think and dissect the anatomy of the system in which working men, however organized, could be shattered and battered and splintered at a single stroke," unquote. I think this is really critical. It shouldn't be surprising that a lot of rail workers have never heard of Debs, don't know anything about him. I hadn't heard of him until I ran into socialists on the job after I'd been there for about 6 years. Socialists who were there assaulting, on the lookout for hot-headed rebels without a clue like myself. But there are some that do not know some of this history. And more than once I've heard something to the effect of, "Yeah, I'm all about Debs, the labor fighter and militant. We need a general strike, etc. But I'm just not into that socialism stuff." That thought process needs to be forcefully challenged. Under the leadership of Debs and the American Railway Union during the Pullman strike, there was a level of unity, solidarity, and militancy that today's militant rebels and activists in the labor movement can only dream of. Debs learned the hard way that having that massive level of unity, solidarity, and militancy among the working class was not enough and will not be enough. If we, the working class and our allies, don't find our way to combine the fight for social and economic justice with the challenge for political power, we will continue to set ourselves up for the potential for violent repression when the rulers feel threatened and they feel that the political cost will be minimal. This is such an important lesson of Debs' legacy for today's fighters. The industrial working class and the rest of us who create the wealth need to mobilize our economic power, and along with our allies, small business people, farmers, etc., the vast majority of us need to mobilize our superior numerical majority into a movement that can challenge for and ultimately conquer political power from the tiny minority that rules today. The ruthless exploitation, misery, and suffering that Debs fought against tirelessly was bad enough back then. But the urgency of our historical challenge today is exponentially exacerbated by the very real threats to our survival. Not only the threat from man-made climate change, but also the inevitable march towards World War III and capitalism's death agony with nuclear weapons now in the equation. So what did Debs mean when he said, quote, "From the crown of my head to the soles of my feet, I am Bolshevik and proud of it," unquote. This quote is from an article he wrote titled "The Day of the People" in February 1919, while his conviction for violating the Espionage Act for his Canton speech opposing World War I was on appeal. In this article, among other topics, he weighs in on critical internal dynamics in Germany and Russia at the time, the struggle between the opportunists and the revolutionaries. Debs was very clear in identifying himself with what he knew of the Russian Bolsheviks. No one identified with the Bolsheviks unless they specifically rejected the Menshevik program and particularly their practice. The Russian Revolution thrilled Debs. He heralded it and celebrated it. Marx once said, "The philosophers have only interpreted the world. In various ways, the point is to change it." My personal opinion is Debs definitely would have known this quote, and it was specifically important to his view. Debs understood that action was required. Internal factionalism was something he hated. People should be judged by what they do. The Bolsheviks at the time were the crowning epitome of what most working people in crisis situations knew they needed, that they did what had to be done with discipline as well as principle. It's worth noting World War I was supported by socialist parties around the world, and Debs didn't see this as a debate topic, but evidence that those parties were no longer socialist. It's also worth noting that many militants of his day had possibly the personal experience of living through the Paris Commune and the political chaos, wars, and repression that followed. That helped form their understanding of what was at stake whenever battle lines did get drawn for workers. What is the relationship between the crisis of the Socialist Party of America, the rise of progressivism, and the wider crisis of the American Revolution experienced in the aftermath of World War I? I'll just be brief with this one. In my opinion, the rise of progressivism was intended to steal some of the thunder from and co-opt the popularity of Debs and the Socialist Party by championing some of the most popular no-brainer demands. The persecution of Debs and other socialists for speaking out against World War I, followed by the Palmer raids, show how threatened the ruling class felt by the growing popularity of these ideas. The repression of that era made it much more difficult for the Socialist Party to regroup after the split in 1919, and for the newly formed Communist Party to get its bearings, to get its foothold, especially as political disagreements in the Soviet Union began to come to light. How did Debs understand the role of the Socialist Party in the struggle for socialism? Debs' understanding of what was required for a revolutionary socialist party evolved over time. Debs wanted the Socialist Party to be an educational and organizing force, a tool of the working class. He opposed both simple trade unionism and electoralism, but thought the party had to be able to help workers understand that. Electoral politics had to be a means and not an end. Any campaign needed to be a platform for socialist education. World War I taught him that the party had to be an opponent and not a partner of the existing political order. While Debs supported the Bolshevik Revolution, he always maintained that the Socialist Party in the U.S. must grow from American conditions and traditions and not dictated by, for instance, the Comintern. What lessons does the life and legacy of Eugene Debs hold for emancipatory politics today? Debs in his life and evolution foreshadowed perhaps, or summarized the historical lessons of working people, at least in the U.S. He began his political career as a worker who still believed in the existing order of Democratic Party politics. He was forced by his own experience and that of his working class comrades around the world to understand that only a break from that was possible if we are not to surrender to the repetition of history. In my opinion, something that gets overlooked was Debs' capacity to continually question and challenge his own convictions and beliefs, to adapt and change them when applicable, when confronted by real-life events and/or alternative theories and analysis. From being against strikes early in his career as a labor leader to being the leader of one of the most monumental strikes in U.S. labor history. From being a Democratic Party politician in his early days to the most prominent, popular, fire-breathing revolutionary socialist that has emerged from our ranks. Now granted, he never did come around to being convinced of the need for a revolutionary combat party modeled after the Bolsheviks in this country. None of us get it 100% right first time every time. But he did draw the line. On war, supporters of capitalist war betray and abandon socialism. On racism, any capitulation to racist sentiment aided the oppressor. Collaboration with capitalist parties. He learned the hard way that any alliance with Democrats or progressive capitalist reformers had to be opposed and did not believe this was a matter for debate. He was suspicious of party intellectuals. First and foremost, he didn't think they understood how to talk clearly to be understood by ordinary workers. He was our greatest railroad labor leader and advocate for socialism. He never lost sight of the fact that capitalism is evil and incompatible with human civilization and justice. He never abandoned the goal of freeing working people, and he was a soldier all his life for that cause. In that way and many others, his example needs to be understood and duplicated. I just want to close with this final thought. In the same way that Debs and other socialists related to and supported the Russian Revolution, socialists today have a similar challenge in how we relate to and support the Cuban Revolution when it's being challenged like never before. Do I have like a minute and a half?
Yeah.
Okay. Actually, I'll close with this. This was written by James P. Cannon, who was one of the founders of the Communist Party, leading the split, one of the participants of the split. This is a statement on Debs' death by the International Labor Defense. The militant labor movement of which the International Labor, and this was a statement on his death, the militant labor movement of which the International Labor Defense is a part mourns today the death of Eugene V. Debs. The cause of the class war prisoners suffers an especially heavy loss in the death of Comrade Debs. His name is linked with every labor defense struggle that took place during his life of activity in the labor movement. The prisoner of Woodstock in Atlanta was close kin to all persecuted and imprisoned workers. Comrade Debs was not one of those who shrugged shoulders at the imprisonment of workers as though it were a matter of small concern. He burned with indignation at every case of capitalist persecution and was always in the vanguard of the fight for its victims, whoever they might be and whatever their political views or affiliations. He rose above the narrow partisanship that seeks to destroy the spirit of unity and solidarity in the labor defense movement. Although a member of the Socialist Party, he had nothing in common with those elements represented by the Jewish Daily Forward who fire from an ambush at the movement for united labor defense. He helped to build where they try to disrupt. His consistent stand for unity and solidarity on this issue is the strongest rebuke to them. Comrade Debs rendered great service to the International Labor Defense. He hailed its formation as a big step forward towards unity of all forces in the fight for the class war prisoners and became a member of the National Committee serving until his death. He responded generously to the many calls made upon him by the International Labor Defense despite the constant sickness that harassed him, and frequently reiterated his endorsement of his work. His appeal to the American workers in behalf of Sacco and Vanzetti, his last public document, was written for the International Labor Defense during his last illness. Eugene V. Debs left to the workers' movement a life record of unceasing struggle on the side of the oppressed, of dauntless spirit and careless disregard for personal rewards or hazards. It is a priceless heritage. That heritage belongs to the revolutionary workers. Let them claim it for their own. Today, the grief of militant workers is heavy indeed, but the grave of Comrade Debs is not the place for tears. He was a warrior, and at his grave we raise a battle cry and begin again with the forward march. James Buchanan.
Hello. Well, first off, thank you for the invitation. I always love participating in these Platypus panels. And the spirit of my talk is going to be a continuation, kind of what Mark was emphasizing in Debs, which is the unity as a focal point of his work. This year marks the 100th anniversary of the death of Eugene Victor Debs. It also marks the 100th anniversary of the birth of Fidel Castro. You mentioned Cuba at the end of your speech, another figure that's very important for me. I think it is fair to say that within the country, the socialist left has basically collapsed since the heyday of the Socialist Party, when it would easily garner almost 1 million votes, even with Debs in prison, as was the case in 1920, and up to 6% of the total presidential votes, such as occurred in 1912, the most successful independent socialist campaign in the country's history. The motto of Platypus, as someone who's, of course, from a very different tradition, nonetheless rings very true to me. The left in the U.S. is dead. This doesn't mean there aren't a lot of people who sympathize with vaguely socialist ideas, but a sovereign socialist left just doesn't exist and hasn't for quite a while. There's no independent socialist organization achieving the political success the Socialist Party achieved in local elections, nor the sheer number of votes they garnered in presidential ones. There is likewise no independent socialist organization with remotely anywhere near the power the Communist Party had in its heyday, from 1932 to the start of the Cold War, where it was able to sport almost 100,000 members and key positions in the labor movement, in tenant and unemployment councils, in the Black freedom movement and the struggle against apartheid, and in the cultural milieu of writers, artists, and academics. Looking at where we are at today, or perhaps since the left is dead, where our absence is felt most, it is worth going back to the self-criticism that Debs performs in 1920, shortly after the split. I'm going to read a somewhat extensive quote from an article of his, but I think it's quite pertinent, so I took the liberty to share with you most of it. The labor movement in the United States, he says, in proportion to the working class, is the weakest and most backward in the world. There is an utter lack of coherence and clarity and unity of aim and purpose when it comes to organization, economic and political, as a whole. There has been a socialist party in the United States for 42 years. He's, of course, connecting the legacy of the Socialist Labor Party and the Socialist Party here. During which time, cargoes of literature have been distributed. What a very nice expression, cargoes of literature. Thousands of speeches have been made, and untold sacrifices and privations in the service of the cause. And we ought to have a powerful, united, and aggressive party to show for it. But as we have not, there must be something wrong that will have to be set right before we can succeed in the future, where we have failed in the past. One reason, he says, and a very real one, why we have not better succeeded in organizing the workers is to be found in our intolerant attitude and ill-tempered spirit towards those of our own class and of our own ultimate aim who differ from us. Socialists, communists, and others spend more time and energy fighting each other than they do fighting capitalism. Each faction assumes that it is entirely right and that all the others are entirely wrong, a very human way of seeing things, he says, but one far better calculated to prevent rather than to promote the effective organization of workers. There are, of course, and of necessity, differences between these groups and of organized workers, and these differences are wholesome and can result in clear understanding and a corresponding unity and solidarity, provided that they are met in the right spirit and are made the means of promoting intelligent discussion. This is still all Debs, by the way. But if such differences are allowed to provoke ill temper and ugliness of spirit, the result is disastrous, if not fatal, to efforts to unite the workers in a class-conscious body for a common principle. And that is what has happened among us and kept the labor movement in a backward state in America. Why can't we differ without denouncing each other, says Debs. Why can we not give those with whom we differ credit for being at least as honest as ourselves? Why can we not reason with those with whom we disagree in a decent spirit instead of treating them with ridicule and contempt? Personally, Debs says, I don't find it necessary to hate and denounce those whose methods differ from mine. They may be right. I don't think they are, but I have been mistaken a good many times in the past, and am just as apt to be so now as anyone else. That's the end of the quote. Debs could have written these words in any moment from 1920 to 2026, and it would have been true about the state of the U.S. left. In fact, I would venture to say that today the divisions which he speaks is perhaps even much more prevalent. It is in the same spirit that I have crafted my work to critique what I call the purity fetish, this incessant obsession with only working or supporting that which measures up to your pure idea, either your pure idea of what socialism looks like, or what a national history should look like, or what an enlightened and socially liberal working class should look like. What is often lost sight of is this common purpose that Debs speaks of, the class struggle for socialism. To put it in the wisdom of the everyday American expression, what's missing is keeping your eyes on the prize. It is fair to acknowledge and in goodwill debate our differences, but this should not tend towards the fostering of sectarian splits or to creating great walls to prevent collaboration and coalition amongst different organizations which share common causes. What Debs was articulating in this article is embryonically what Mao would develop 17 years afterward with the category of principal contradiction. To keep our eyes on the common purpose, as Debs mentioned, is to keep our ultimate focus on the principal contradiction. This doesn't mean that time can't be spent analyzing and debating other contradictions, but divergences in secondary contradictions, or others even farther removed, should not be cause for division when a common assessment of the principal contradiction of our time is shared. I think it is this Debsian attitude which the left, if it is to be resurrected, needs to regain. It will go against those who profit from division, which isn't just the ruling capitalist class, who ultimately, of course, profits the most by staying in power, but also the leadership of all the microsect organizations who feel their territory and organizational treasuries and funding threatened by the existence of others. Unity, therefore, must be dialectical. Excuse my jargony expression. This is what keeping the principal contradiction in mind entails. For those who divide for the sake of defending their tiny fiefdoms and the material benefits this monasterial attitude affords them, for them it is clear that the principal contradiction is not the struggle for socialism. It is the self-preservation of the positions they occupy as self-proclaimed dissidents of a certain form. When this self-preservation is your goal, the struggle for socialism and the success of it presents itself as a threat to your fringe subculture. The unity of which Debs speaks is not an abstract, let's all get together and sing kumbaya attitude. He holds instead a dialectical understanding of unity which takes into account the fact that unity itself must include mechanisms for identifying which forms of unity ultimately lead to greater forms of division. Or as Karl Liebknecht put it, the great German communist leader who was killed alongside Rosa Luxemburg, he says, not all unity means strength. Unity between fire and water puts the fire out and causes the water to disappear as steam. Unity between a wolf and a lamb results in the lamb finding itself inside of the wolf. Another great expression. Unity between the proletariat and the ruling class is to sacrifice the proletariat. Unity with traitors means defeat. The attempt at unity between those who have their ultimate purpose as advancing the struggle for socialism and those whose actions point towards the underlying purpose of self-preservation and sectarianism. This type of unity is not only highly improbable, but in the cases where it could be achieved, is likely to foster a greater division than before, given that contradictions are operative at the level of what each side considers the ultimate principal contradiction to be. To wrap up, I think there are many reasons why today there is no strong independent socialist movement in America. Just to name a couple. One, a failure to attune Marxism to an American context. That was one of the things I tried to do in my recent book, Why We Need American Marxism. And two, a failure to adapt to how subjectivity is constituted in the age of digital media, and therefore how, for lack of a better word, ideology operates today. But as or if not, and in some basic ways more central than these, is the question of building the concrete and principled unity and difference which Debs identified 106 years ago as one of the greatest fetters for the development of socialism in America. It is his Debsian wisdom which I think is today most relevant for those who seek the left to be reborn in America. It is his attitude which animates the American Communist Party, which I am proud to serve, as many of my comrades here in the room. It is not an abstract call for pan-leftism, but a politics of principled unity which overcomes the purity fetish and keeps our eyes on the common cause, the red star and the red flag which we fight to raise up high. As the American working class finds it harder to make ends meet, drowns in debt, desperation, and despair, sickened by the utter degeneracy of a capitalist class who exploit, who assault sexually, who bomb and feed off of our children, women, and men, the American Communist Party will stand unwaveringly in unity with all who seek to bring down this demonic Epstein regime and the capitalist imperialist system which it serves.
I have to start, Carlos, the quote from Debs that you used in the Debs that you used towards the beginning reminds me very much of a poem by March Piercy, the poet, that she wrote in the 1960s or early 70s about, partly about disputes on the left, where she said, you know, the comrades are never hitting so hard as when they're fighting the comrade on their right. I think there's a lot of truth in that. So I represent the Freedom Socialist Party, and it is a revolutionary socialist feminist party that started in 1966 in Seattle. You can find out more about us on socialism.com. Thank you to our Canadian comrade for grabbing that domain decades ago. We have branches in the US and Australia and a close working relationship with several parties in Latin America. Our members are very active in the union movement, including AFSCME, Teamsters, and the Transit Union, which I was a member of. We are also in a militant cross-union organization called Organized Workers for Labor Solidarity, or OWLS. And that OWLS and the FSP have been very supportive of the Railway Workers Union over the past few years. So I'm especially happy to be here with a representative from RWU. I do think that this discussion about the meaning of Debs' life and ideas is an important one for those of us who want radical change today. They have a special relevance now with the rise of socialist ideas and popularity, and with the election of social democratic mayors, Zoran Mamdani in New York and Katie Wilson in Seattle. I'm going to touch on some of the same facts and themes that previous speakers have, but I do believe that it is intriguing and perhaps instructive to consider what Debs would think of what is happening today. Debs was a giant of the early U.S. labor and socialist movements. My first introduction to him was through the writings of James Buchanan, who's been referenced, one of the founders not only of the Communist Party, but then of the Trotskyist movement in the United States. Cannon was born in 1890, and so he was 35 years younger than Debs. But they had very similar and overlapping political stories up to a point. Both were members of the Industrial Workers of the World, the Wobblies, and both were members of the early Socialist Party. Debs was a founding member of both of those organizations. Cannon did not know Debs personally, but he was present at times when Debs spoke, and like I say, was a member of the same organizations. As has been mentioned, Cannon and Debs parted ways politically and organizationally after the Russian Revolution of 1917. But Cannon always held Debs in high esteem, and they were both part of an international united front that has also been mentioned, defending class war prisoners like anarchists Sacco and Vanzetti at the end of Debs' long life. In a long essay on Debs, Cannon wrote that on the honor roll of the socialist pioneers, Debs' name leads all the rest. To start at the beginning with some basics, Debs was born in 1855 in Indiana. He came of age in a time of incredible hardship for much of the working class. The capitalists were ruthless. Conditions were dangerous and generally abominable. The unions that did exist were, as been said, mostly craft unions, which represented the more skilled and privileged workers in a specific trade. Debs and other founding wobblies like Big Bill Haywood, Mother Jones, and Daniel De Leon pushed the cause of industrial unionism. This is the idea that all the workers in an industry should belong to one big union rather than be divided into different smaller unions according to the type of work that they do. Debs said, "Federation means unity and strength. It is many in one." This great change in how workers organize was a massive contribution to class struggle in this country. Debs' first jobs were on the railroads. His very first job at 14 was scraping paint and grease off train cars for 50 cents a day. With the coming of industrial unions, it meant that laborers, like the scrapers, could combine forces with the higher skilled engineers and conductors employed by the same company. Those years of the late 1800s and early 1900s were tumultuous. They were years in which working class and progressive activists were experimenting with new ideas and different organizations. And Debs was no different. When young, he had a stint as a Democratic Party politician, about which he later said this: "There was a time in my life before I became a socialist when I permitted myself as a Democrat to be elected to a state legislature. I have been trying to live it down. I am as much ashamed of that as I am proud of having gone to jail." And he did go to jail more than once. The first time was for violating an injunction during the bitter strike of the American Railway Union in 1894, which he led. By then, Debs had experienced the real brutality and intransigence of the bosses and the collusion of the government in keeping workers exploited and powerless. In jail, he had time to read and reflect, and he studied socialist works by Marx and Karl Kautsky. After his release, not all at once, but over time, he became a revolutionary socialist dedicated to the overthrow of capitalism by workers' revolution. For his time, Debs held very advanced ideas about the rights of black workers and women, and here, too, his thinking developed over time. From originally seeing black workers simply as equal comrades in the class struggle, which was progressive enough in that period, he went on to understand that the oppression of black Americans was a special question that required making special demands on the system. Similarly, Debs stood against discrimination against women in the workplace, but also went further. He encouraged women's leadership in strikes and organizing, and he supported causes including women's suffrage and birth control. The accomplishments of Debs and of the Socialist Party in those early years were legion. The Socialist Party in the U.S. was one of only 2 or 3 social democratic parties internationally that stood firm against World War I. Debs ran for president under the SP banner 5 times, gaining a remarkable 6% of the vote in 1912. The last time he ran, it was as convict 9653 in prison for his opposition to the war, and he got just over 914,000 votes. From the start, the Socialist Party was not a homogeneous organization. Cannon called it a variety store of socialist politics. Debs was part of the group's class struggle, revolution-oriented left wing. In 1909, as the party membership began to grow rapidly, he wrote to a colleague, "The revolutionary character of our party and our movement must be preserved in all of its integrity at all costs, for if that be compromised, it had better cease to exist." Heading up the right wing, the reformist wing, was Victor Berger, based in Milwaukee. While Debs toured the country popularizing socialism and supporting strikes, Berger was busy maneuvering within the party to turn it into a reformist electoral machine concentrated on mainstream politics, especially at the local level. Berger and his crowd within the party tended to push the question of socialism versus capitalism far into the background. Instead, they concentrated on immediate ground-level issues like public improvements in areas like schools, parks, potholes, and public utilities. Mocked as sewer socialists, some of them ended up embracing the label. There are radicals and socialists today who believe this would be a good model for the left to follow now. Even if those radicals who believe this themselves believe in systemic change, they argue that it is a smart, pragmatic choice to appeal to people not on this basis, but on the basis of supposedly achievable reforms. This grossly underestimates where millions of people in the United States are at. More people than ever understand capitalism as the root cause of terrible problems like war, environmental catastrophe, authoritarianism, global poverty, and the rollback of hard-won rights and freedoms. The millionaire and billionaire abusers exposed in the Epstein files make them sick, and so do the ICE agents rounding up people at schools and job sites and shooting people dead in the streets. They are sick of the corrupt two-party system. Free transit, affordable housing, and child care. The things being pushed by Mamdani in New York or Katie Wilson in Seattle are important to people, but people have a lot more on their minds. Electoral politics are by their nature limited in what they can accomplish under capitalism, especially here in the United States. Socialists like Debs see the value of engaging in elections mainly in order to reach out to people widely and recruit to socialist ideas. He told the crowds who came to hear his campaign speeches, "There will be no change in conditions until you workers become the master of the tools. Debs certainly believed in fighting for reforms, but he didn't believe in reforms as the end game. He didn't approve of so-called socialism. But as mentioned, he hated intra-party fighting. Just as he believed in one big union, he hoped for one big socialist party, uniting all the different tendencies. But a union and a party are different beasts. Debs applauded the Russian Revolution and never deviated from his Marxist ideas once he embraced them. But when the showdown between the revolutionaries and the reformists came in the Socialist Party, largely sparked by the 1917 revolution in Russia, Debs didn't fight for his position the way his authority would have allowed him to. When the party split, Debs stayed with what had become the right-wing majority, while a good part of the left wing split to found the Communist Party in 1919. Debs had profound differences with the CP in the years that followed, but remained steadfast in his defense of workers hounded and persecuted by the capitalist state. In 1925, the Communist Party initiated a nonpartisan defense organization for class war prisoners, a united front called the International Labor Defense, or ILD. From the beginning of the ILD during the year before he died, Debs served on its national committee. And again, as mentioned, he wrote his last public statement on behalf of the ILD. It was an appeal for justice for anarchist immigrant workers, Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti. They were framed for robbery and murder in 1920 and sentenced to die. Although workers and civil libertarians around the world rallied to their cause, the two were executed in 1927. Debs was, how's my time?
You got about 2 minutes, but if you go slightly over.
No, that's excellent. Debs was one of the most loved and renowned labor and socialist agitators, orators, and organizers of his time. His life leaves us much to emulate. Not least are his non-sectarianism and internationalism, from his brave opposition to World War I to his staunch defense of political prisoners throughout his whole life, no matter their national origins or political affiliation. In the last year of his life, he began thinking seriously about organizing a labor party. And what he said about this labor party is, I don't want it to be a small p progressive party. I don't think it should be a middle class party. It can have people other than workers in it, but it must have a labor program, and it must be a political vehicle for workers to fight. Debs probably could not imagine what workers are facing today. Workers and women and LGBTQ plus folks, people of color and immigrants, other oppressed people all around the world. Given things like the Iran war and the climate crisis, workers are facing the threat of literal annihilation. And that is on top of the exploitation and injustices and unnecessary poverty that Debs fought that we still have today. It seems to me that part of the point of this whole convention is to try to answer the question, can the left rise to the occasion? I think for right now, the answer lies in our willingness to form democratic united fronts. We don't need to be in the same party to collaborate and fight rising fascism, imperialist war, and the rollback of centuries' worth of advances for workers' rights and human and civil rights. And we can compete over our ideas at the same time. But we have to put the working class first. It is really a question of survival.
Thank you. The title of my talk is Eugene Debs, Progressive. There are three views of Eugene Debs and of the Socialist Party he led: the orthodox view, the revisionist view, and the progressive view. The orthodox view is the view from the World Revolution. During his 1917 sojourn in New York, Leon Trotsky told the left wing of Debs' Socialist Party of America that the World Revolution was coming and a new type of party was needed to lead it. The left wing's 1919 manifesto explained why. Quote, "Political action is a valuable means of propaganda," the manifesto argued, "and the capture of legislative seats is an effective means of capturing the political state. But this capture of the political state is merely for the purpose of destroying it." Channeling Marx, the manifesto cautioned that the moderate socialist aims to lay hold of the ready-made machinery and wield it for his own purposes, thereby falling into the error of believing he can eventually legislate socialism into existence. Quoting Rosa Luxemburg, the manifesto described Debs' SPA as sausage socialism, mixing real socialism with bourgeois reforms. Meanwhile, the New York Call, a socialist daily aligned with the centrist SPA leader Morris Hillquit, declared it too early to tell who was right: Luxemburg and Liebknecht, the socialists who threw their support behind the 1918 German Revolution, or Ebert and Scheidemann, the socialists who suppressed it and them. The Call advertised Liberty loans to fund the American war effort, and in Milwaukee, where Hillquit ally Victor Berger ran a socialist political machine, party members were permitted to openly support the war and to serve on labor councils organized by AFL President Samuel Gompers to prevent strikes in war industries. Unlike the German party, the American party, including even Hillquit and Berger, staunchly opposed the war and never voted to fund it. But Hillquit's aldermanic delegation did vote to fund a victory arch in New York City. Thus, William Z. Foster would quip that the Hillquits and Bergers are only Scheidemans and Noskis, lacking opportunity. Hillquit, Berger, and their left-wing critics all drove the SPA to split in 1919, while Debs languished in prison. Multiple communist parties formed, seeking affiliation with Lenin and Trotsky's Third International. Though Debs remained with the SPA, he encouraged his party's aborted 1920 effort to affiliate as well. And by the early 1920s, Debs' disagreements with the SPA's reformist drift were significant. As his biographer Ray Ginger writes, "The socialists were furiously attacking the Russian Bolsheviks, the American Communists, and the Third Communist International. They had, in effect, abandoned the campaign for industrial unionism in favor of a working agreement with the Gompers grouping and the AFL. Their political program had been reduced to the effort to stimulate a broad reform party based on the craft unions, in which they could recoup their waning fortunes. The theory of the class struggle had disappeared from the socialist philosophy, and the party was following the same program of right-wing opportunism which Debs had so heartily condemned in the past. Still, Debs would not split, and by 1924, the communists gave up on recruiting him. You, although claiming to be a left-wing revolutionary, accept the leadership of the Second International, the butchers and betrayers of the revolution," Foster wrote in a public letter to Debs. "The American Socialist Party is cut from the same cloth." Trotsky's appraisal was similar. Debs was a sincere revolutionary, Trotsky argued, yet he succumbed to the influence of people who were in every respect his inferiors. Hillquit's art, Trotsky continued, lay in keeping Debs on his left flank while he maintained a business friendship with Gompers. The orthodox view has echoed for over a century. The SPA was, quote, "not the needed party of a new type," wrote Foster as Communist Party chairman in 1952, but was patterned after the opportunist-dominated Social Democratic Party of Germany. The Trotskyist James P. Cannon concurred. Debs and Lenin were divided on the narrow question of the character and role of the party, Cannon wrote. By including petty bourgeois reformists and proletarian revolutionists in one political organization, the SPA was simply introducing a form of the class struggle into its own ranks. The eventual breakup of the party and the decision of the revolutionary elements to launch a party of their own was the necessary outcome. The Marxist, Leninist, and Trotskyist organizations birthed or revived by the New Left and later by the Millennial Left have all shared this orthodox point of departure. The revisionist view is the view from the failure of the World Revolution and the consequent stillbirth of the Third International. Lenin's 21 Conditions diagnosed a period of acute civil war, which necessitated the removal of all reformist and centrist socialists from party positions and the creation of parallel underground and above-ground organizations. Quote, "The Moscow program wants to commit us to a policy of armed insurrection," Debs cautioned in 1920. it would kill the party. Debs viewed the Third International as experimental. Even from prison, Debs could see that its tactics were premised on a mass revolutionary sentiment that had not, at least in the United States, been sufficiently prepared. As Ginger observes, the communist practical illegality has stimulated in some members a glorification of underground activity, a juvenile posturing in place of decisive action. Their sectarian tendencies, reminiscent in some ways of Daniel de Leon, had alienated large groups of revolutionary workers. Several of Debs' close friends had left the Communist Party because of these errors. In 1922, James Buchanan convinced Trotsky, and thereby the Comintern, to force the American communists to abandon their underground tactics of which Debs was so critical. But communists like Foster were still basing their strategic outlook on the assumption of, quote, revolutionary ferment among the masses of American workers. In a 1924 open letter to Foster, Debs' friend Scott Nearing made a more honest accounting of where this ferment could actually be found. The revolutionary sentiment in the United States is strong among certain foreign-born workers, particularly those of Slavic origin, who have been most emotionally aroused by events in Russia. It is strong in certain districts, such as Butte, Montana, Seattle, and in parts of New York and Chicago. In most of these cases, however, the strength is in the foreign-born districts. It is strong in certain needle trades, railroads, machinists, and miners' locals. Again, however, it centers in the Slavic and other foreign-born elements. The masses of American-born workers and farmers are discontented, but they assume that times will pick up. There are, of course, many exceptions, readers and thinkers who have kept up with the world and who have not been fooled by the propaganda. But they are relatively few. Whatever revolutionary sentiment there is in the country today cannot be described as in any sense American mass sentiment. The communist failure to gauge mass political sentiment in the American working class drove Debs' skepticism of the Third International's ability to exercise strategic leadership of American socialism. The communists reporting to Moscow may have been America's foremost revolutionists, but that did not make them America's foremost revolutionaries. Released from prison to find his party shattered by Wilsonite repression and the socialist movement divided into petty fragments, Debs called for united front action in the economic and political realms. In 1923, he endorsed Foster's Trade Union Educational League, which coordinated union radicals across political tendencies, but Debs paired this with a call for political unity as well. In 1924, when socialists and communists both supported the movement for a labor party forming around the Conference for Progressive Political Action, Debs attributed the tendency of many parties and unions towards unity to the SPA's prior 27 years of tireless organizing. But the 1920s would prove confounding for Debs. He may have been the first Second International radical to squarely confront a condition resembling our own. Progressive politics predominates. Organizations deriving from the Second and Third Internationals cannot escape its gravitational pull, and none prove capable of even beginning to build a mass revolutionary party. Perhaps Debs, who can so easily appear to us as a fossil of the 19th century, was in fact our first contemporary, facing the dawn of our shared century of counter-revolution. Echoes of Debs' revisionist discontents were heard in the 1950s, when the Debs centennial was followed by the Khrushchev speech. In 1956, the CP's journal called for a new united mass party of socialism that would unfreeze the situation which has remained solid since 1919. Followers of the ex-Trotskyist Max Shachtman observed the ensuing debates with interest and defended the revisionists against Foster's attacks. The Communist 1923 program, Shachtman observed, would have met with Morris Hillquit's cheerful acceptance in 1919. So, Shachtman asked, was the 1919 split historically justified? No. Shachtman's revisionism would inform Hal Draper's attempt to seek for the New Left an alternative organizational model to the microsect. Meanwhile, James Weinstein would carry the CP's revisionism into his late 1960s campaign to lead fellow historians Eugene, Genovese, and Christopher Lasch in an attempt to found a mass socialist party on the Debsian model. More recently, Platypus founder Chris Patron called for socialist unity and cited the pre-World War I SPA as a precedent for his campaign for a socialist party, of which I am a member. The progressive view, finally, is the view from revolutionary capitalism triumphant. In 1916, the sociologist Fred E. Haynes surveyed the history of third parties from the Greenback Party of the 1870s and 80s to William Jennings Bryan's Populist Party of the 1890s, culminating in Theodore Roosevelt's 1912 Progressive Party. In 1924, Haynes expanded his survey to include the SPA. Minor parties, Haynes wrote, are a means of agitation, an expression of social discontent. It is only necessary to read the platforms of the minor organizations to find the origin of many of the planks that are later prominent in the proposals of the Democratic and Republican parties. The chief function of third parties has been to bring new issues before the people. They force new policies upon the older parties, and after accomplishing their work, they pass away. The larger the number of votes cast for a third party, the greater probability that its issue will be adopted by one or both of the great parties, rather than that its manifest strength will help it to displace or take a place alongside the established parties. In time, the causes which minority parties have the temerity to espouse are taken up by the established organizations when direct appeal to the latter may have proven fruitless. Haynes interpreted the fate of the SPA in these terms. The, quote, socialization of the Democratic and Republican parties under the leadership of Bryan, Roosevelt, and Wilson, Haynes wrote, explains the insignificance politically of organized socialism in the United States. So long as the two major parties and their leaders remain so amenable to permeation from outside, no socialist party will have more than temporary importance or success. The SPA did not always fit so neatly into Haynes' thesis. As the sociologist Daniel Bell would do 28 years later, Haynes faulted the SPA for the quote-unquote irresponsibility of its abstract anti-war position. Haynes contrasted this to the socialists who left the SPA to form the Social Democratic League in support of the First World War and Wilson's 14 points. Despite what Haynes and Bell took to be this missed opportunity for American socialists to win reforms by supporting the war effort, Haynes could already predict in 1924 that, quote, social democracy is coming rapidly as an orderly progress from one reform to another. 12 years later, SPA presidential candidate Norman Thomas complained that FDR did not carry out the socialist platform unless he carried it out on a stretcher. By 1948, however, when the SPA orbited the New Deal coalition with less than a remnant of its Debs-era strength, the historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. could plausibly present Debs as John the Baptist and to FDR as Jesus Christ. Schlesinger channeled the words of an old Debs-era socialist. In the fight against the political aspirations of the business community, Debs played an honorable role. Those years of education forced on the people, in towns big and little, from pulpit, platform, and soapbox, by voice, leaflet, and books, saved this country from civil war in the depths of depression, and gave Franklin Delano Roosevelt the understanding public and trained workers for the immediate job he had on taking over. In 2019, the historian Jill Lepore profiled Debs in the New York Times. After Debs, Lepore wrote, socialism endured in the New Deal, in Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, by way of Bernie Sanders, a Debs disciple, and by way of the utter failure of the two-party system. When Platypus was founded in 2006, Chris Patron quoted Walter Benjamin's injunction that even the dead are not safe. Past struggles that failed or were betrayed can be failed and betrayed again, Patron continued, and needless suffering in the present and future that could have been averted will not be. 11 years later, Patron declared that the millennial left is dead. The millennial left restored the Democratic Party via the Sanders campaign and via anti-Trumpism, and it failed, even worse than the new left before it, to build a new socialist party out of a once-in-a-generation crisis of capitalist politics. This death of the millennial left has rendered Eugene Debs a progressive once again. Now, Debs' legacy is the capitalist state.
We'll now do brief responses, 5 to 7 minutes. We'll go to Mark Burrows first.
I'll defer to somebody else right now. I'm just still kind of soaking it all in.
We can come back to you then.
Yeah.
You're also passing. Okay. Well, I think one of the things that's come out of this, I mean, there seems to be a lot of agreement about Debs as a revolutionary, which a lot of historians or biographers kind of tried to soften his meaning and say, oh, you know, he was American. You know, he was messenger of Americanism, and the values he fought for were typical, Protestant and American values and so on, which doesn't really ring true at all when you read his own words. But I think one of the themes that people have touched on in the panel is socialist unity. What does it mean? Is it possible? And what I think is that what we need is socialist collaboration, a willingness of leftists to work together. And in that process, I'm kind of stealing part of my talk tonight, but what are you going to do? In that process of working together, you can find where you have real programmatic agreement and where you have fundamental disagreement. I think a socialist, I think that the problem of socialists working together is like a main problem of right now, because we do have plenty of people who think of themselves as socialists in the United States, but we are very fragmented. And part of that is unavoidable because of really serious fundamental differences, but part of it is a process of historic splits and regroupings and things that might not be that hard to overcome if we really wanted to do it. And I think Debs's idea of I think what Cannon said about Debs' Socialist Party being a variety store is an important point, because I think you have to be clear about what kind of socialist party you are. And so in that, I'm very interested to hear more about the plans for the campaign for a socialist party. What's the vision? Would it be a one big tent party? I could say another one big tent party. Or if not, what would be the thing bringing people to this party?
You're ready to go now, Mark?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay.
I'm just going to kind of have some fragmented thoughts of things that have been raised, so bear with me. I failed to, and I want to thank Platypus for inviting me to be on this panel, and I agree with what's been said about united front activity as much as possible, and what the sister was just talking about, how to whatever extent possible that socialists can work together. There's so much potential common ground. I think if we all had a constructive, civilized discussion as mature adults like we're having right now, we could find a lot of common ground. And so the challenge is to find that common ground, agree to disagree where we find those disagreements. Oftentimes those disagreements, while important, are not necessarily critical in the moment. There will come a time when the disagreements will be critical and decisive, at which point, we'll have to really debate it out, again, with civility and mutual respect, and hopefully may the best, correct, tactical, strategic ideas win. I want to talk about the split for a little. In my opinion, it was necessary, and one of the things Cannon wrote the foreword to this book, Eugene Debs Speaks, which is I would highly recommend it. And in the foreword, to summarize it, in the same way we think about how Marx characterized socialism as the evolutionary process of society, the next stage after capitalism. A way that I might look, the Socialist Party USA, I would argue that it was part of that. It was a necessary process. We all had to go through it, and so it was they had to go through it. The big tent, the revolutionary socialists like Debs and the burghers all in the big tent, and it was part of the process that we all had to that they had to go through, and the Bolshevik Party, Lenin and Trotsky, showed the way forward of the kind of party that's ultimately needed to ultimately wrest state power from the ruling class. So I'm not going to be critical of Debs for not going along with it. I can understand. He had devoted his whole life. He had devoted his whole life to the building of his party, and he hated factionalism, and he just wanted to go out on the road and advocate for socialism and win people over, while Berger was doing his thing, while the reformers were doing his thing. So I'm not going to be critical of that. It is what it is, One of the things, what Debs was able to do was when you read the speeches where he's really advocating for socialism, and when you've read Marx, and then he's just taking Marxism and translating it into the language for the American working class. Some of it's almost like verbatim quotes from Marx, but it's translated to be able to for the American working class. My personal opinion is our next historical challenge is some form of an independent political party, whether you call it a labor party, whatever. It needs to be based on the foundation of organized labor, of a revitalized labor movement, and that's our next historical challenge. I'll leave it there for now.
Thank
You. For me, the question that stimulated the most reflection out of the prompt wasn't even like one of the questions. It was one of the prelude comments to the questions, which had to do with the split. Was the split historically necessary? I spent the whole week researching and pondering, and I wrote a presentation about that, and I realized there's no way in hell I can contain it to the 15 minutes. So I decided to do a completely different presentation, very last minute. But it's so interesting because the more and more research I did, the more you come to realize, as with most things, that both sides had, to some degree, truth on their side. To other degrees, what in hindsight would appear as certain presumptions that were negative. Mark, you mentioned in your presentation, well, now you mentioned you're not going to fault Debs for not accepting, for staying with the SPA and not accepting the Leninist party model. I think that's one of the limitations of Debs, right? Because the Leninist party model is, I think, the structure whereby which that fundamental goal of unity that he's proposing in that 1920 article could be realized, because the basis of the Democratic Centralist Organization is we're going to debate, we're going to have democratic consultation, but we have to have unity of action. Because if we have a division in terms of how we're going to act, we're going to be weak. We need unity of action. And then once you have a basis like that, then you can engage with your own sovereignty with other organizations and have collaborations, as Andrea mentioned, which it's not like unifying yourself into just one big group with a bunch of factions, because that would kind of just be the SPA, but having the sovereignty of different organizations and dialogue. And that's what, in the quote that I brought up from Debs, which was extremely impactful for me, that seems to be what he is advocating for, at least. Let's sustain our sovereignty, but let's work together. One of the things, I really appreciated your presentation, Ed. One of the things that I couldn't help but notice, as someone who, of course, aligns with the tradition of the Comintern, and I think you referenced Patron a few times. I believe he's called me a neo-Stalinist, which I'll accept it, happily. One of the things that, to kind of take a stab at my tradition here, I try to be an honest Stalinist. In the SPA, part of what I see, at least from the limited research I've done, generated some of the anxieties of the right wing with Victor Berger and the center with Morris Hochwit. Seems to be that the left wing was so keen on joining the international. I mean, the Comintern, the Third International. But if you looked at the 21-point program of that Third International, there was a few points in it that quite frightened them. One of which was basically to purge from leadership all of the reformist elements that were aligned with the Second International. Because, of course, the reference point is the Second International parties that supported the war, that supported war credits, that turned around and condemned the Bolshevik Revolution, but our party didn't, right? The SP, the Socialist Party of America, with, I believe, the Italians as well, were the only 2-3 parties that condemned that. So there was points in it. The other point that Debs wanted to join the Comintern, but it got to his analysis of one of the points specifically. I think it said something along the lines of, in the end, the Comintern decides. So if there's disputes within the country, your own party wouldn't have sovereignty over what it is that you are going to do. In the end, the Comintern decides. And I think that's always been one of the great limitations of the Comintern, the Third International. I understand why, because who else had won the struggle it was them who won, and so they have a certain capacity to be braggadocio about it and to say, listen to us, we actually did the deed. But they did the deed because they were attuned to a Russian reality. And when they try to dictate the policy of countries from Moscow, they preclude others from developing their own Bolshevism. And it's not without reason, I think, that some of the most successful communist revolutions of the 20th century came in the aftermath of certain breaks with that dogmatism of the Comintern, whether it's the Chinese revolutionary process, which, of course, was a lot of beefs between Mao and Stalin about it, and they ultimately had to go down the route of sinifying Marxism, and that's what worked for them. Or the Communist Party of Cuba. For those that don't know, I'm Cuban. And in Cuba, there was a Comintern-aligned Communist Party. It did not support the July 26 movement. It considered them ultra-leftist. And then the Communist Party that is now in power, the PCC, it was like a reconstitution of that original Communist Party without some of the mystical shells, to borrow Marx's expression in terms of how he relates himself to Hegel. So I think the split was necessary. I think it was inevitable. I agree with Foster. You referenced Foster. He has a great book on the history of the Communist Party. The way he phrases it is that from the beginning, there was these class contradictions that ran very deep within the SPA that were bound to lead to something, and all that the Bolshevik Revolution did was just bring them out to light. And that was like the last straw that produced that. So there was something inevitable. In those first 10 years, what you get from the splitters, from the CP, which were forced to split, in part because of the right, again, the right had its own anxieties of getting themselves purged. What you get from the splitters is an extreme form of sectarianism. I think you referenced one historian that compared them to Daniel de Leon and the Socialist Labor Party. And it's true, they were extremely sectarian. But the principle that they were holding on to of the Leninist party model, I think that was the rational kernel. Even though in that moment, I feel like the spirit of Debs I really like the quote that you brought up. I think it was from Patron as well. I praised Patron way too much in this talk, guys. You guys have to stop. But that Debs is a contemporary of ours. We think of him as his ancestor, but he's actually a contemporary. I think that's absolutely right. But I think he can be a contemporary because in part of this split. I read this split as a mistake in that moment because it almost destroyed the Socialist Party. The Communist Party didn't arise as a great sublation of the Socialist Party. It would take many years for it to garner strength. And in that moment, the socialist movement was tremendously weakened. But it was a necessary mistake. And it was a mistake that, in doing it, provides us the conditions for the possibility of looking backwards and seeing it as a necessary mistake. And therefore, it's one of those errors that, as Hegel talks, that happen throughout history that are not necessarily errors fully, stop. They're errors that are moments in the process of the development of history. The problem in our case is that there has yet to arise that third moment, that second, like the second Communist Party that arises in Cuba, or the sinification of Marxism that arises in China that allows it to succeed. We have yet to, prove in the eating of the pudding the necessity of that moment. But at least we can have faith in the fact that it was a necessary split that creates the conditions for something greater to develop later on.
All of your presentations have reminded me of a conversation I had with my friend and comrade in both Platypus and the campaign, Nate Smith, who's here with us in the audience. Something he reminded me of recently as we were talking about Debs is just how rare it is for someone to come to Marxism by way of practical political experience. Most of us, I don't know about all of us, but most of us come to these ideas as intellectuals. And Debs, not to say Debs was not an intellectual, but it was really his politics and his sort of practical political decisions as an organizer that led him to Marxism eventually. And I guess I say that in the context of the split, because I think he was particularly sensitive to questions of strategic judgment that were ultimately very political. And I think of someone like, the enthusiasm of a kind of bohemian intellectual like John Reed, for the October Revolution. I think some years prior, Reed had been a Woodrow Wilson supporter, if I'm not mistaken. I don't mean to sort of, throw John Reed under the bus, but just to say, with Debs, you're talking about a different type of person. You're talking about a much more politically serious person. And so I think he was very sensitive to a misjudgment of the imminence of mass revolutionary sentiment in the United States circa 1919. And this is someone who's in jail. So it's not as if he's insensitive to the state coming down on the movement, massive repression. It's not as if he's insensitive to some of the forces that might be radicalizing people just domestically. But still, he thinks there's a kind of fatal overestimation. That said, a source that I think many of you would also find interesting that I'd recommend to the audience, recommended to me by another member of Platypus, is James Cannon's correspondence with the historian Theodore Draper. It's really excellent. And Draper found Cannon to be a very reliable interpreter of that period. And Cannon did point out that there were times, such as the one I mentioned, when the Comintern was actually able to offer very politically sound advice and strategic correctives to the American movement. So it wasn't completely one-sided or the other. But to your point, you could say that Debs was sensitive to the issue of sovereignty, as you put it, but I think it's, the way I think of it is more in terms of his, again, he's an organizer, he's a very politically serious person, and there's almost an epistemological question of whether the Third International, whether Moscow is going to be able to be as cognizant of the political realities in the United States as he thinks is necessary. That's the most I can make sense of his rationale at the time. I guess and that sort of relates to a question that you posed. And, I should say I myself am not really much of an organizer, but I think, in many ways my membership in the campaign is more aspirational. But I think the model is to begin with organizing, civil social organizing, activism of essentially a liberal nature, that rather than begin with programmatic unity or ideological agreement on Cuba or Epstein or whatever you have in mind, that it would actually be much more about building organizing capacity on the ground, and that would have to be done quite massively in order for it to become a pole of attraction, if you will, or in order for it to become something that wider circles of people on the left would find important and worthy of their support and participation. So in that sense, we're sort of sensitive to not putting the cart before the horse of like programmatic or ideological agreement. That would have to be earned. We could only be so lucky as to earn a revisionist dispute, as to build a party and movement so strong that we could earn debates about splitting it. And in that sense, I guess, Carlos, one question I have for you, since we come from very different, somewhat different intellectual traditions, like as a Stalinist, as someone who looks to Mao, one question I have for you is like what sense you make of the history of left unity attempts, because I'm aware of some, but not many, and I'm wondering like how you arrived there from your background and what you make of the success or failure of those in history. But I also realize you might want to open it up to...
if you want to
Okay.
briefly respond, and then we'll go to questions.
I think they've been almost always utter failures because of reasons of dogmatism and because of real contradictions that occur in how it is that people come to interpret what is that principal contradiction, right? Because I can sit here and talk about how we consider imperialism to be the principal contradiction, and I'm sure there'll be many people in the audience that would disagree. I can articulate why we do that. We think of it as the class struggle, but in a global arena. But I think that there's this lofty aspiration for leftist unity, and that's where I had started when I left the Bernie campaign in 2020 and founded with Eddie the Midwestern Marx Institute. We just wanted to try to bring every party together and unite, because we hadn't joined the Communist Party yet, and we were reading literature from everything, and we're like, all right, there's disagreements, but there's a hell of a lot more in common. And at some point a few years ago, we were like, this is kind of unrealistic, on the basis of the fact that a lot of the organizations, they fall into this extreme narrowness of the everydayness of their work, and they just want to reproduce that. And it's not the stuff that makes up the history books, but the sorts of resentments that leaderships in different organizations develop towards like new young people doing stuff and attracting parts of their base and potential members of their party or whatever, and then on that basis, like participating in rumor mills and spreading lies and trying to actively sabotage other organizations. Unfortunately, that is what has happened every time there's been a call for like left unity. I do still think we have to kind of be irrational here and take a Kierkegaardian leap of faith and nonetheless call for unity. But I think it has to be done, at least this is my interpretation of it. For us, it wouldn't have made sense. I look back at when I was doing that just as like Midwestern Marx, and it didn't really make sense. Now, as having a party with over 1,000 cadres around the country doing work, now it makes more sense because it's like we have something more concrete upon which to base collaborations. I mean, at a very practical level, there's grassroots organizations around the country. There's one that I'm thinking of right now in Orlando that has like basically 3 whole blocks controlled. It gives away like 300-400 meals weekly. It has its own gym for self-defense training for militants. It has a coffee shop that all of the members come into, and we collaborate extremely closely with that organization. Some of their leaders are in the party. A lot of people end up joining the party from it. And that's the sort of unity that we envision. They have total sovereignty to do whatever they want, as does the party, but there's still a basis from that sovereignty to unite. And that's the spirit of, maybe unity isn't a better word, or collaborations or something. You mentioned collaboration. That's something I think it's practical. I see small glimpses of that in the work that we're actively doing and have been over the last 2 years. And I think that is helpful, but ultimately, you're absolutely right. Like, every attempt at a mass leftist unity has led to that much, except for maybe the Cuban Revolution, right? Which went beyond just left and added certain nationalist elements while being rejected by the Communist Party. So like the most left part of that united effort rejected the united effort, while mainstream leftist, social democratic elements and nationalist ones supported it. But yeah.
I think we only have one mic. Do we have another microphone?
No, Ryan tapped me to help move the microphone around. We can project this out.
We'll just keep my phone here. Okay.
Well, Ryan asked for me to move around, so especially if you don't speak really loudly, let me know. Give it to you.
Okay. Danny, do you want
Yeah, very quickly, and I thought this already kind of came up in the responses, but I really want people to think about this and kind of give their best shot at it. To what degree is both Lenin and Debs right?
Yeah.
Right? And what might that say about how we actually receive Debs, and even talk about him even glowingly in terms of, oh, he's great, you know, a man-check hero in that sense. But I feel like that's like a thing in the background is, were they both right, maybe? And then how does that, affect how we think about Debs?
You want to take that, Ed?
Just in the, provocative black pill spirit of my conclusion, they were both wrong. Lenin led to Stalin, Debs led to FDR. That's the other reversal, right? Like, in reality, in 2026, unless it is made to be otherwise, that is sort of the bleak verdict of history.
Well, I think in the question of the split, politically, Lenin was right, because a vanguard revolutionary party is necessary, and a socialist party with many different, really antagonistic, not compatible wings, is not going to be able to sustain itself. But I think that, and part of the, I don't think Leninism leads to Stalinism. I think that the historical circumstances that the Russian Revolution found itself after the revolution led to Stalinism, and that was not a failure of the Bolsheviks or a failure of Lenin. It was due to material circumstances. So I think Lenin was right, but I don't. But I have a lot of understanding and sympathy for where Debs was at. But I don't think that kind of, big tent variety store socialist party can really help workers get to the point of seizing control of the state, which to me is the point. If we don't want to keep losing reforms, if we don't want to keep, on this path of disaster that we're on, the capitalists have to be overthrown. And I don't think a socialist party like Debs is going to do that. One thing that I was thinking about that relates to this is, I think the era of reforms is over. It's the capitalists don't have any more give because their system is in so much trouble. And we see it all the time. Everything is going backwards from, economic reforms, labor reforms, abortion, voting rights. And so, I mean, we really need to make the change. And I think that it's a Leninist party that can be the vehicle for workers making that change.
It's interesting because we're going from Leninism to Stalinism. Leninism doesn't have to lead to Stalinism, and then back to Leninism leads to Stalinism.
Right.
Because Stalinism for me is just Marxism, Leninism. Yeah. I hope you don't break the trend. Right? Okay, perfect. It was a good seating arrangement. I mean, part of what I tried to give in the spirit of my comment was precisely that. You know, there's it's a both ends, like an Antigone situation where the incoherence of the general objective predicament necessarily means that you're both right and wrong, right? Bury the brother, you're both right and wrong. So yeah, I wasn't thinking of it in terms of just Lenin, because there's this interesting thing that Foster mentions, which is he's very critical of the early splitters because of their sectarianism, and he says, by the time they read left-wing communism and start engaging with Lenin's critiques of ultra-leftism and the sectarianism that's tied to it, especially the critiques of the dogmatists for like dual unionism, they begin to change and they begin to look for efforts that seek unity across different people. So I would say the Comintern's. It was the Comintern's mistakes, and if I'm not mistaken, it was Zinoviev, the head of the Comintern at this time, right? Not a historian, philosopher. So, but I think that mistake of the Comintern in the Debs Comintern relationship, where they're both right and wrong, is rectified precisely, I think, through Lenin's writings. Which in a certain sense are closer to the spirit of Debs in some ways than to the spirit of the copy-paste method in which the Comintern was applying their insights, which were valid in other areas, but onto the United States.
I'm going to basically second everything that the sister, and I'm sorry, I forget, I'm bad with names, so, but yeah, what she said, and just to be clear, so in on the split, Lenin, to me, Lenin was right, Debs was mistaken. I can be critical, but I'm not going to trash him at the same time. I mean, for all that he contributed, and Cannon explains it, just the introduction to this book, he explained it so clearly. I'm okay with it. For all that Debs contributed to advancing socialism in this country, which is the most important. We are in the belly of the beast, and so the socialist revolution in this country is really going to be decisive if we for the future of humanity, without being hyperbolic about it. And so Debs has contributed so much to that. So I can allow this particular disagreement on this particular. I mean, he was in jail at the time. But I will say that Debs and Lenin and Trotsky are responsible for James Cannon. All of us have mentioned James Cannon, and I would highly recommend that people go seek Cannon out, and I would also argue Farrell Dobbs as another apostle who learned from Cannon. And I just want to say, it's important to not think of Debs as some history project. His ideas, what he wrote, what he said, they stand the test of time. For a young person who what is socialism? Some young person asked me that, rather than, I could give them the Communist Manifesto, but I would rather give them some speech that Debs wrote, where he basically translated the manifesto for a young person, for a worker. His writings and speeches are like a primer to just introduce people to what it can be, and they stand the test of time today. You can read the things that he wrote and said, and it's like, yeah, this is like right now. It's important to not look at him as just a study in history. I'll leave it there.
Okay, just briefly. Just briefly, if my initial answer was the left is dead, I also have a long live the left answer, which is, what if the world revolution had spread? What if the German Revolution had been successful? What if it had prompted further revolutionary ferment and mass consciousness in countries like France, Britain, the United States, etc.? Right? For example, if you read two books which I'd recommend, Trotsky in New York, 1917, by Kenneth Ackerman, and The Socialist Party of America by Jack Ross. They're both written from this kind of Bundist perspective, sympathetic to Morris Hillquit, and they're sort of like a black book of Leninist and Trotskyist unnecessary sectarianism, right? They very well catalog the necessary critique from the vantage point of the failure of the world revolution. But what would have rendered Lenin and Trotsky correct? Something that was very plausible at that time, which was that the world revolution would continue. And I think Debs, probably under those circumstances, might have been the first to see that conditions had changed, and that actually some different tactics and strategies, and maybe even a split, would be necessary in the American case, right? So that's how I would say they were actually both right. That it's at the time it was not clear what would happen, and they were both expressing a possibility.
Could I say one thing to that? Well, I think that that the Leninist Party is part of the preparation for making it a revolution possible and ready. So I think you don't just hang back until it looks like, oh wow, everybody is wants to take the White House and change the system. I mean, the Revolutionary Party is part of that process.
Doreen?
Oh, great. All right, I'm going to be loud. I just had 2 points from thank you for all the talk, and I appreciate the comradliness of which we are all discussing all weekend. I really appreciate that. The thing that I think is missing sometimes in the idea of the left is dead, and with the long live the left, is that the ideas carry themselves forward. They never died, says he. That's the Joe Hill song, right? He never died. His ideas, his fight, his, the struggle, it doesn't die. It might wane. There might not be high numbers, and it's like we're looking for this mass movement of socialists and revolutionists. Well, there's a lot of material reasons why that has not happened in this country. I think you cannot leave out what happened to McCarthyism within the McCarthy period, what they did to the labor and left movements. That is a big reason why we don't have a bigger, more solidified left, or a Labor Party, or many of these other things. And I think that's a condition of the United States. But because I know a lot of Platypus members like to read books, I have a couple of books because we're talking about the Comintern and what happened after the 1917 revolution and their role, is that there's 2 books, Volume 1 and Volume 2, the first 5 years of the Communist International. And there's this correspondence and speeches going on working with, because part of what the Russian revolutionary leaders, Lenin and Trotsky, realized is that there has to be a revolution in another country, and it has to happen soon. We cannot survive in Russia without it. We will not survive. And so they were really, and Germany was so damn close. I know we have a lot of German comrades here. We can, and that whole history is just, almost. But it was also Italy, France, England, and so there was all this correspondence in those 2 volumes that helped me see the picture of why it didn't happen. It was a lack of maturity of the communist movement. It was the influence of social democracy from the very socialist part. There's a lot of reasons why. Plus, just the repression of the state. So, anyway, I would highly recommend that. And then I just wanted to add, because we're talking about James P. Cannon, in one of the books that Andrea has, it's in my bag out there. It's the first 10 years of our party, but it has a quote at the very beginning. Since you're looking at the campaign for a socialist party, this is why I thought of it, is advice from James P. Cannon. If you're going to start a political party, the first thing you have to define is your program. And the next thing you have to decide is what are you going to do? What is to be done? So anyway, if you want to see that quote, I have it in the bag also. Happy to share. I'm sorry, no questions there. But I would love to know what you think about that.
The gentleman with the CTA hat, I was just told you might have a comment to add. Is there anything?
Just very briefly, I'm also a member of Railroad Workers. I need to project just a little more, sorry.
Yeah.
I'm also a member of the RWU, the Railroad Workers United. I'm a railroad worker all my life. I'm actually on the transit end outside of things. But in terms of keeping Debs alive, Brother Burroughs here, he edits our monthly newsletter called The Eyeball, the railroad joke. And he writes a column every month. It's rare that a month goes by that he doesn't talk about Eugene Debs. So he's really doing a job keeping him on.
Excellent.
Ali?
Hi, thank you. Yeah, I'll project. I know there's already been a lot of quoting, so I'm sorry to quote a little bit more, but there's a very interesting speech from W.B. Du Bois called If Eugene Debs Returned, that was given on the occasion of what would have been his 100th birthday in 1956. And at the very end of this, it's interesting to read in its entirety, but at the very end of this, he tries to ventriloquize Eugene Debs and says, and so Eugene Debs, returning with both sorrow and relief to the blessed peace of heaven or the genial warmth of hell, this depending on whether one reads the Timer or the Worker, will, I imagine, after a season of rest and reflection, look carefully about and say, quote, what I really fear for America is not merely loss of freedom, degeneration of schools, failure of the free press, or failure of democracy. These reason and time will combat. Rather, I fear the threat of insanity, the loss of ability to reason. And it ends with this line. It says, brethren, I firmly believe that what my country needs today above all is more and better insane asylums strategically placed. But I mean, I want to stick to that idea of like, well, maybe the question at work in the split is like the loss of the ability to reason, that this is maybe the thing that Debs feared above all, as Du Bois indicates, and maybe this is the thing he's trying to preserve in, retaining his relationship to the Socialist Party. The question of immaturity, perhaps, is maybe another way of getting at the question of reason, or the ability to retain a critical capacity, this idea that Debs is pointing to. And I just wanted to invoke that suggestion from Debs as maybe one of the things operated. I wanted to see what y'all thought of that.
Yeah. Anyone want to take that up?
Well, I think there's a lot of insanity today, but I think it's largely at the top. What your comment made me think about was an explanation of, we're just all about the books today, aren't we? An explanation of what the fractures were and what the problems were of the earliest Communist Party. And again, that's first 10 years of American communism by canon. And I don't, do I understand that you were thinking that the insanity was coming from the splitters? Is that what you're saying?
I'm leaving it open.
Oh, you're leaving it open, okay.
But I mean, I guess the point would have been that, like, is this something that maybe Debs would have had on his mind? Is Du Bois right that perhaps this is one of the things that Debs would have been considering?
I don't know, but okay, one other thing it brings to mind, before somebody else collects their thoughts, is really the insanity of the system. I mean, the Marxist dialectical and the Hegelian dialectical idea is that as a system or an entity comes to the end of its life, it becomes more and more irrational. And I think we're seeing that today. But it's not going to come to the end of its life by itself. We have to make it happen.
I guess briefly I'll just say that from a certain sort of like triumphant mid-20th century, despairing but triumphant mid-20th century liberal progressive perspective, it might seem like Debs, again, is this 19th century fossil. You know, the Enlightenment, the bourgeois revolution carries into the working class into the late 19th and early 20th century, and then after that you have mass society, you have distraction, you have propaganda, and suddenly it's just a question of technocracy because the people can't be reasoned with. So the whole notion of, like, imagine the left today publishing a paper called Appeal to Reason. It would seem sort of antiquated, right? Who reasons today, right? Like, on what basis would you appeal to people's reason? It seems like this fossil of the 19th century, and the 20s appear to be this watershed after which that's no longer possible. But perhaps if we think of the fact that the watchwords of the old socialist party and movement were organize and educate, we can consider the fact that organization came first, I think. Don't quote me, look it up. But I think education came second, meaning perhaps on the basis of more organization, more education, more appealing to reason would be possible. That's not a particularly Marxist insight. That's just sort of a classical proletarian socialist insight. Right? But society has become so disorganized and the left so unable to organize anyone or anything that the kind of education that you could undertake, the kind of appeal to reason that you could undertake by actually knowing society, by actually interfacing with it, trying to change it, trying to reshape it, that's gone. I can't do that. You probably can't. Probably not. Almost none of us in this room, could even approach that. But they actually did.
I want to actually comment on the comment or / question that was made before, in the spirit of somewhat disagreeing with the left is dead, because of course the idea remains alive in some sense. This is a comment that Badiou makes in the Communist Hypothesis, where he says the idea is always going to be alive insofar as there's people willing to take up the hypothesis. And I tried to be very specific in my presentation and kind of do like a little Stalinist distortion of the left is dead, because I qualified it as the U.S. left is dead. Because I, of course, do think the revolution spread. It spread to China, it spread to parts of Africa, it spread to parts of Latin America, and it was meaningful. It spread in Korea, which I believe a lot of you are not going to like me saying that. For me, it did spread, but it didn't spread in the West. There was what my friend Haas calls a sort of translation problem, where for some reason, maybe bourgeois partisanism, there's some hypothesis that we have developed along those lines, but for some reason, it didn't spread in the West. But I do think it spread. And I do think that the left in the U.S., if I can maybe adjust my comment, it's dead in a structural sense, in the sense that it doesn't exist as an independent political entity that can exert any weight meaningfully over existing politics. I think most of us would agree that in that sense it's dead. But it also exists in this weird interregnum of kind of being like undead, where it's not alive in that sense. It's also not fully dead because, I mean, just turn on the TV, whether you're watching CNN or Fox News, both sides are calling the other side every once in a while a communist or a socialist. And so there's this logic operative, this sort of hauntology. Socialism continues to haunt the ruling class, even if maybe it shouldn't, maybe they give us more, maybe they believe in us more than we believe in ourselves, right? Because they're still haunted by our presence, and it's this very interesting presence that takes the form of an absence. And it reminds me of this comment that Sartre gives in Being in Nothingness, that's situated in the context of the Second World War and German-occupied France. And he says that when you go in a cafe and the denizens of the cafe that you see every day are no longer there, there's a presence to that absence. And that's the state in which socialism exists in the U.S. It's this undead interregnum, where it's neither fully present, it's neither fully gone, but it just haunts. It still continues to haunt. And then now we're back at 1848, right? So that's what, originally it was.
No, sorry.
I agree with something you said earlier, that in some way Debs is sometimes thought of as like a provincially American to a fault, right? He's disconnected from these European questions of socialism and capitalism, the Industrial Revolution. He's just made to be, Jesus Christ, or something like that, or just a populist. And I completely agree with that. On the other hand, though, Debs does seem to sort of live and breathe the bourgeois revolutionary ideals of the American Revolution. And I guess in that sense, my inner Shachtmanite has to ask you all, what do you think Debs would think of Cuba or China or North Korea? Because I think something we would all agree on is that he wouldn't call for U.S. state intervention, like military intervention. I certainly take that point. But since we're talking about Debs, I guess to me it's very hard to imagine that he would be uncritical of realities and developments there, however sympathetic he might be to maybe certain initial aspirations or intentions. So I'm curious, when you think about Debs specifically, and then you think of those realities today, what do you think, how do you think you would think of them? I don't know if anyone wants to.
My personal opinion is, I think Debs, in the same way that he identified with and supported the Russian Revolution, I'm confident that he would be a supporter of the Cuban Revolution. Now, with regards to, say, North Korea or other, just call it, let's just say other so-called, communist, socialist that have some kind of Stalinist type leadership, he would uncompromisingly defend them against U.S. imperialism, absolutely. But he would reserve the right to be academically, intellectually critical as applicable. That's just my take. And with that qualification, I'm confident that he would support the Cuban Revolution. So that's my answer to that.
I think it's a very good question, and in my opinion, Debs follows the spirit of 1776, but not he follows the spirit of the law, not the letter of the law in terms of the logic operative in 1776. And there's this very concerted effort that's made by Foster, which I actually think is a continuation of Debs, and it gets back to a lot of the stuff that Mark was praising Debs for, his ability to just translate the basic insights of Marxism in a manner that resonates with regular American workers. I think he understood the value of the need to Americanize Marxism. which means to carry out that translation, and in conjunction with that, the fact that socialism in America is going to look distinctly unique. It's not going to look like socialism in Bolshevik Russia. It's not going to look like China. It's going to look like American socialism, right? To borrow the expression of the Chinese, it's going to look like socialism with American characteristics, because what the hell else is it going to look like, you know? And I think in that spirit, I do have trust that Debs would have been able to see these projects, whether it's the DPRK or China or eventually the development of Soviet Russia, as forms that socialism takes, as universal content of socialism taking on distinctive national forms, because that's the only way it could really exist, if it's able to attune itself to the larger civilizational or national realities of countries. And that's why you can't just copy-paste what China did onto the U.S. You know, we get accused a lot at the ACP of just wanting to do what China's doing here in the U.S. In some sense, you know, we like advanced railroads and stuff of that nature, but we're not dumb enough to think that a cinified Marxism is going to work in the United States. So I do have this belief, maybe it's naive, that Debs would appreciate the distinctive characteristics that these struggles for socialism had to take, and that, you know, a lot of those are not things we might want here in the United States, where we have the legacy of European Enlightenment and certain basic things that we value. But I do think he would be supportive, or at the very least against intervention. And as far as Cuba, the interesting thing about Cuba is that Fidel, in his History Will Absolve Me address, he cites 1776 quite favorably, and always did that. And there was this delegation of American students that went to Cuba in the 90s, and they asked Fidel about the U.S. and told them, well, the first thing you need to do is stop letting the right wing take up the American flag. That's your flag too. It's the flag of your people. You need to be patriotic, but be patriotic and, you know, the rational kernel of the best parts of your legacy. And there was a panel I was in Mexico a couple of years ago, discussing one of my books, and one of the critiques that I have is that of other Marxist-Leninists is that they completely reject the legacy of the American Revolution and the progressive traditions, socialist traditions of struggle in the United States. And that was the thing that baffled the most the other panelists, two of which were from the Che Guevara Center in Cuba. They were like, well, if we draw rational kernels from 1776, how in the world are you telling me that people who call themselves communists in America don't? So yeah, just wanted to...
Of course, we had a whole thing about the American Revolution last night. And as far as Cuba, how long do we have the room for?
We can wrap up at 2:45.
No, I'm kind of joking. Just basically, it's Mark, isn't it?
Yeah.
I agree with Marx. Mark.
It's a good Freudian slip.
Ben?
Thank you. My question is about the meaning of the crisis of the Second International. I worry that this discussion has, in a kind of unproductive way, become very tactical, meaning that the appraisal of this history is the question of when were the opportunities to make a decision, who made the right or the wrong decision, what should they have done, when I think that the more important question is what was the nature of the problems and how can you make a judgment about that. In the Platypus reading group, we have a week on anti-black racism in the United States. And we read two authors. The first is Debs. And forgive me, I'm going to read two quotes. And also forgive the anachronism, but I prefer to read the quotes as is. So Debs says two things in the same article. He says, "We are the party of the working class, the whole working class, and we will not suffer ourselves to be divided by any specious appeal to race prejudice." And yet in the same piece, he also writes, "We have nothing special to offer the Negro, and we cannot make separate appeals to all the races." This is in The Negro and the Class Struggle. On the same week, we read a text by Dick Fraser, who is defending a position on the black question in an internal debate in the Socialist Workers' Party, which of course on the one hand is about the black question and the question of whether black people are an oppressed nation in the United States. but it's also about revolutionary leadership. It's that the SWP seems to be abdicating the responsibility for leading black people in the United States. And so, with respect to the Second International, the question of, like, was this split justified? Was Debs right to abstain from it? I think really it's about questions of the nature of the Marxist problematic. The Second International, I think people tend to say it was a split over, imperialism, or the national question, or like, specially oppressed peoples, and a kind of like position that produces like objectively unrevolutionary leadership. But what about the other way around? What if it's about the way that nature of Marxist leadership is conceived that produces these misunderstandings that sort of culminate into existential splits at the sort of historic opportunity? What does it actually mean to say that like Debs and Lenin were both Marxists, especially when they do actually have different tactical judgments, and yet we do have this affinity to them? How do we actually recover these people?
I feel like that one's for you.
Well, I guess I don't feel the need so much to recover them because I don't really feel like they've ever been lost. I think that the leaderships that are produced in a party or a movement are partly a question of the times, because nobody can totally leap over their times. But they're also a question: to what degree can the leadership be ahead of their times and think forward? And I think that the Socialist Party made some huge strides there, like we've all talked about, industrial unionism versus craft unionism, and the idea of workers' revolution. I mean, these were huge things. I did want to, other people may have, a deeper sense of your question. I did want to say Debs did change his perspective on the black struggle in the United States. That was a kind of an early quote, and he did come to, from actual experience, from talking to black audiences about things like the housing question, he did come to a more rounded appreciation of what African Americans in the United States were facing. But maybe...
Yeah, I just also wanted to touch on, I've seen, in fact, from one person who I really respect, and I'm not going to name him, but I've seen recently where that quote has been used to imply that Debs had some closet racism, and that just we can sit here objectively and find the fault with that particular quote, and all he was getting at was he has written enough and said enough. He was a champion against racism, and he ultimately he evolved. And all he was saying with that particular quote at the time was that, that we're all equal, and so no special no specialties, preferences, or whatever. I'm not an authority on where he actually evolved, but my personal opinion. The revolutionary socialists that I have become convinced of, that I have been won over to the importance of affirmative action, the nationalities who have been the most oppressed are entitled to and need special demands to rectify the history of that oppression. But Debs gets knocked on that, and that's just unfair and inaccurate. As far as Debs and Lenin were both Marxists. I mean, as we've Debs translated Marxism to the American worker. Lenin translated Marxism to the Russian worker, but in addition, Lenin developed the concept of the vanguard revolutionary combat party as necessary to be able to really overthrow capitalism. And all of this is an evolution, just as we're sitting here today, is an evolution of that whole process. And hopefully we can continue to move it forward.
The gentleman next to the camera.
Could I just briefly?
Oh, yeah.
Again, how long do we have? But I guess a very telescoped answer would be, simultaneously to our discussion, there's a panel on Bonapartism, right, as a kind of central preoccupation of Marx and Marxism. And part of what the regime of Napoleon III involved was addressing the grievances and discontents of the working class and others through the expansion of the state and of state power. Some historians have characterized Napoleon III's regime as like the first New Deal, essentially, to put it in more contemporary terms. And so, I guess in a very telescoped way, you could say that Lenin is recognizing that insofar as the Second International is successful, it's going to raise the prospect of Bonapartist political tendencies within itself, vis-a-vis the capitalist state, and the German Socialist Party sort of losing control of the labor movement, and the labor movement largely opting to be fit into a Bonapartist state capitalist dispensation circa the First World War, seems to validate that prognostication. Debs is equally critical, and that's precisely why the progressives for 100 years have been critical of Debs. You might think that the kind of race, gender, class framework comes out of the McGovernite coalition of the New Left, but it's actually older. It comes out of the kind of Communist Party model of, organizing, incubating social movements of the 1930s, and arguably it's even older. It comes out of Woodrow Wilson, who leaves the Socialist Party to support Wilson, W.E.B. Du Bois, Margaret Sanger, Mother Jones, right? They decide that they're actually going to get a better deal, whether in race, gender, or class terms, from a progressive Democratic Party. Debs doesn't agree. That's not Debs's politics. If you want a provocative representation of Debs's dissent, read George Schuyler, who wrote the Harlem Renaissance novel Black No More. I feel like if there were a DSA member on this panel, they would hail the ability of the Old Socialist Party to recruit someone like A. Philip Randolph. But I would argue that in his critique of the statist tendencies of a kind of, black petit bourgeois clientelist politics, George Schuyler, arguably for his entire life, he eventually ends up, I think, a Goldwater supporter in the John Birch Society, is a better representative of like a kind of black radical, a truly critical perspective on black politics in his era. A lot telescope there, but that's my intent.
My question is essentially.
Sorry, I meant the.
Okay.
Got it. Sorry.
Okay. I'll ask. Thank you for speaking on this panel. It's been great. I'm going to try to draw together a few threads here, but I'll probably miss some. But, at first I was going to ask about, kind of the German Revolution, kind of Lenin's left-wing communism, because, of course, in that he kind of explains how the left communists are sort of a vulgar reaction to the opportunism of the SPD. But I think what I want to kind of try to draw out is something I'm worried has been kind of missed. Remus Ed said that we have to earn our revisionist dispute, right? And I'm just thinking about that because I hear these terms like of course revisionism, like unity, or like translation, kind of like translating things has come up a few times. I think all of these are like just empty, hollow concepts. Especially in the death of the left, in the absence of a socialist movement. So I guess I'd just put that on the table, but then I'd also kind of put next to it, something that's raised by, Ed, the Campaign for a Socialist Party, and just Platypus as a whole, I feel like is, well, there's the primacy of the centrality of civil society organizing, but then there's also this idea, and I think this is maybe what makes the campaign different from other kind of, sectarian groups or whatever, is there's this idea of putting Marxism in the back pocket, of putting, socialism, communism, whatever in the back pocket, and this kind of ties to the idea that, maybe Marxism is something that has to be achieved, maybe it's not just something we can say. And so I think this is what is trying to be raised when we talk about Debs living and breathing the bourgeois revolutions and just that kind of spirit, is maybe, the action that's being taken today, in civil society or whatever. I mean, this concept of civil society organizing, this is a liberal concept. You don't need Marxism or socialism for this, right? So I guess the question is, what is being raised by the next panel? It's what is the necessity of Marxism? Why can't we just kind of acknowledge maybe a liberalism that is kind of the limit of our current, kind of politics? So I guess I'd just throw that out there.
Who wants to take that up? Mark?
So are you asking, just to commitment, are you asking, do we need to be talking about Marxism? I mean, is that what you're basically asking?
Are we premature without talking about Marxism?
All right, good enough. Good enough for the train of thought that I had. I just want to make sure that. Absolutely, Marxism. When I first started understanding it, what it meant to me was that it in the same way that an auto mechanic learns how to disassemble an engine and to really understand how it works, down to every last nut and bolt. This is what Marx, this is how he analyzed capitalism, by breaking it down to every nut and bolt. And then by doing so, by explaining it, he was able to, and therefore, this is why it is doomed to implode, ultimately. This is why there will be forever cycles of poverty, of oppression, of super exploitation, and as the world, as capitalist countries and empires expanded, ultimately there would be competition between the different empires that resulted in World War I, that resulted in World War II, and we can see that same pattern cycle developing now. So Marxism is absolutely essential to explain. One of the things I used to, when I was talking feces with my coworkers, I would just say, if you can't accurately diagnose the source of the disease, how are you ever going to accurately find the cure? And Marxism is essential to understanding what is wrong, why everything is the way it is. I don't have a half hour to do a laundry list of everything that's wrong, all the problems of society, but every one of them comes down to capitalism, and that's why Marxism is essential to understand and explain, and that's why Debs is so important, because he's one of our best teachers.
Thanks. I'll have a lot more to say about this in not very long from now, but because I'm on the panel tonight. But I think that the idea of is it too soon to talk about Marxism, to introduce Marxism? I kind of feel the same way about that as I think about the question I'm blanking on names. I'm sorry. Ben. I was thinking Alex for some reason. Ben, I didn't mean to, I wasn't meaning to be flip when I said I don't think they're lost. And I think that Marxism, it's not a question of whether it's too soon for us to talk about it. I mean, it's there. It's an inheritance. And I feel like there might be a little bit of an underestimation of what, ordinary working and oppressed people feel and think about the system. I mean, the people we come into contact with in South Seattle are not politically unsophisticated. I mean, they really believe that their problems are not just individual, but that the system sucks. And they may not have words for it, like capitalism and socialism and Marxism, but I think it's definitely not too soon to introduce those words and those concepts, because they will help move people who already have that gut feeling, and also importantly realize the necessity for collective action, not just individual solutions like, lifestyle kinds of adjustments and so on. But I think ordinary people really, I think we have to have some confidence in them. And I think it will do us well to do that.
Oh, sorry. Just before we're coming up to so are you guys happy? Because I was thinking one more question, then concluding statements. Are we all happy with that? Yeah. All right. But no, Carlos, you go.
I think that's a very important question that every Marxist should be asking themselves all the time. I mean, what is Marxism good for in our day? And I do still think it's by far the best framework for explaining what the hell is going on. I think it provides clarity, and there's value in that. I mean, try to understand any of the major events going on in geopolitics and national politics without somehow seeing the background of class struggle and the battle of economic interest between classes. And looking at things from a systemic perspective and the ultimate ends of the capitalist system. I watch all these geopolitical analysts that are so good at like compiling and cataloging facts, and they all align here and there, with the positions that I take geopolitically. But there's so much naivety. It's like, if only this person, if only the U.S. did this instead of that, right? If only, like, when we went to negotiate, we remembered the American people instead of, like, it's like, no, you fucking, sorry, can I curse? You can't, because it's the system, and I listen to these people, and I catch up on facts and the stuff that has happened with them, but there's such an incredible naivety when they don't bring up capitalism and how the system works and how it subdues the ultimate telos of the ultimate purpose of everything to it. And I find this interesting predicament. I'm a professor at a community college, so I speak to students that come from working class background, half of them usually like black, the other half brown, and they just fucking get it, they just, Marxism is just almost intuitively understood. And I made this one very provocative statement last summer when I came out to Chicago that ended up being featured on Fox News. I said all Americans are already communists, they just do not know it yet. And it's kind of like the old cartoon of the Roadrunner scenario where he runs off the cliff and he only falls when he realizes that, oh shit, there's nothing keeping me up. That's kind of the state that the American people are at. I mean, we have trouble in the ACP talking to regular workers who don't sympathize with our perspective, whether they're coming from like a Biden labor background or MAGA. In fact, we saw a lot of potential in MAGA, of course, as an objective development of forms of dissidence, embryonic though they might be in parts of the working class. So the question is the problem ideas, right? Is the problem just that the people have this false consciousness where if only we educated them more, fixed their ideas, well, when we talk to them, they kind of already agree with us, irrespective of what background they come from. So, and they all universally hold this cynical distance to official narratives. I mean, by all the measures that we can find in terms of statistics, only like 11% of the American people trust the mainstream media. That's the most important ideological apparatus, constantly pumping out the things that they should believe with regard to certain ongoing world events. And that 11% is usually like, older populations. The more you get into the younger generations, they don't buy it, the stuff that the ruling order is selling them. So I'm very much a Shishekian here. I do think that the problem of ideology, if we can call it that, I don't like calling it that because logic of ideas, and the whole point is that it's the problem is not at the level of ideas. When people have this cynical distance and there's this crisis of legitimacy, this crisis of authority, this crisis of belief, you can't just go to the ideas. You have to ask, well, what's keeping it alive and continuously reproducing itself? And it's people's actions. It's the fact that they know what they do, but they do it anyways. The reformulation from Peter Sloterdijk of Marx's dictum and when he talks about the commodity fetish. And so the question for us at a very practical level in terms of our organizing of the ACP is how do we build what has always been called dual power? Because what that does is not just provide a framework for like, here are different ideas. It provides a new institutional basis for structuring a new series of actions and practices and trying to de-link people from the sorts of institutions, practices, and rituals which reproduce the ruling order even if they sustain a safe cynical distance at the level of explicitly formulated thought. Which is why I mentioned earlier the problem of like bourgeois Partisanism, the problem of reducing the understanding of what a human being is to just a cogito, a thinking substance. The human being is not a thinking substance. You can change the ideas, but if they have the same fundamental practices sustained, you're not going to change the outcome.
The woman next to Ben, and your closing remarks will be in response to this question, if that's okay.
Can I have a mic?
Yep.
No pressure. You get to bring us home.
So I wanted to address, since the American Revolution is the theme of the convention that was raised here, and Carlos, you mentioned that Fidel Castro held up the American Revolution. But I wanted to maybe push against this idea of the American Revolution as a people's revolution, or the American people's revolution, because I think what this does is it sequesters the American Revolution to a confined geopolitical region, whereas I think, and it also undermines the fact that the American Revolution was something that was unleashed onto the world, right? Like you can't, it's ongoing, whether we like it or not. And what would Debs say about Fidel Castro holding up the American Revolution as the people's revolution and the model for the Cuban Revolution? And also, in some ways, this concedes to the conservative upholding of the American Revolution as a people's revolution.
Yeah, just to mark, we'll just go in the same order that we started.
The American Revolution it is what it is in its time, and there were certainly conflicting and competing interests, but people like Thomas Paine was somebody that I can identify with as a revolutionary of that time. And so I totally agree with the point that Carlos raised about the story of his exchange, that to a point we need it. I totally agree that we do need to take that, the spirit of rebellion. The spirit of rebellion, the spirit of fighting against tyranny, the spirit of fighting against injustice, irregardless of that not all of the founding fathers that we may relate to or that we would consider revolutionaries by our definition, but the act itself of rebelling against tyranny, that's what we should connect with, and it is a very valid point that we should take that as our own and not concede it to the right wing. So I just want, and just since it's my closing remarks, I just want to make a plug for the Eugene Debs. We've been talking about Debs, and I'm grateful to Platypus for all of you being here to be part of this discussion. And the Eugene Debs Foundation is working their ass off to try to preserve the legacy of Debs. And so Google it, perhaps make a contribution, become a sustainer. RailroadWorkersUnited.org, Google it, you can find it. I don't have barcodes to pass out or anything. I also want to make a plug for the Chicago Cuba Coalition. Google it, get on their mailing list, or see Steve in the CTA hat, get on their mailing list to find out about local events. And Belly of the Beast, Google it, get on their mailing list for journalism from Cuba itself. So my answer and final remarks. Thank you.
Yeah, I think you can't have a revolution that's not popular. That's why I think even the bourgeois revolutions were themselves popular, because they had to tap into certain contradictions that the popular sectors of society themselves had with the ruling order, and that's why you had to employ this language and phraseology in their political philosophy, talking about commonwealth and community and public and very universalist discourse in order to defend a very particular narrow bourgeois interest. But nonetheless, the revolutions were popular. If it was just the bourgeois carrying it out, it would have been very few people, for it to succeed. So I do think that the American Revolution was a popular revolution, and I think every revolution has, to a certain degree, universal import. Agreement here with Herbert Aptheker that the American Revolution was the first anti-colonial revolution in the hemisphere, and it inspired both the French Revolution and the Haitian. And I think in many ways the American Revolution is to the left of where we're at today still. I think the American Revolution is still much more revolutionary than that left, which doesn't yet exist in the US, because imagine a document today that says not only do you have the right but the duty to overthrow a government that oppresses you. By golly, you'd be called a jihadist and you'd be arrested, which is what maybe is on the horizon of the ACP. I don't know. We're called the green red on Wikipedia. We're communist jihadists or whatever. But in any case, yeah, you read I show my students the Declaration of Independence every semester. There's a whole class we dedicate to it. And it's so incredibly radical, and you can't come out of reading that document and knowing the revolutionary history of America thinking that it's an irrelevant event that's just out there in the past. No, we have to tap into it and figure out the ways in which we can recapture that revolutionary spirit of 1776 and attune it to our own specific times, to the logic of social media. And this is one of the things that the far right has been extremely successful at, with their memes and their edits and all that stuff. At a very practical level, those are kind of the things that we have to start thinking about doing. How do we make the American Revolution, its revolutionary spirit, cool in ways that disarticulated from the dominant framework and ideas, institutions, political alignments that it's currently attached with, and re-articulated towards a revolutionary project for our current times.
Well, I think the first thing that you can say about the American Revolution of 1776 is that it was contradictory. I think that the idea that you could talk about all men being created equal at the same time that most of the people that you were speaking to were not included in the rights of the new country is you can't ignore that. But it was, I think it did have popular support to a certain extent, or it could not have triumphed. And I think that it is the working people that were responsible for the most progressive parts of the new republic, like the Bill of Rights. Where I really agree with you is that the American Revolution has to be an international revolution. We have to be conscious of the fact that we have imported everything that goes along with America to the rest of the world, and a lot of that involves bloodshed and oppression and our own U.S. sort of colonialism. I think that I'm glad you asked the question, because I think internationalism really is important, and I think that if we don't have the consciousness that we're part of an international working class, we are going to doom ourselves. And I think we owe support to people struggling internationally, a lot of it because of United States policy. And I think the best way that we can, and we need their help in making our revolution, and I think the best thing we can do for other revolutionaries in the world is to make the revolution here. But we can't do it by ourselves.
Your question makes me want to go back to the books and undertake a lot of research on every single one of Debs's comments on sort of international affairs. I haven't done that, but just speaking from memory, I guess I would want to close by signaling a respectful dissent from the notion that Debs would have supported this kind of national roads to socialism idea. On the one hand, as we discussed, he was very sensitive to very specific political strategic considerations on the ground. I think we all agree with that. But I can't think of a single instance when he supported the abrogation of what we might call bourgeois rights, such as to speech, assembly, and press, and so on the grounds that that was consonant with some kind of national culture. Let me give just 3 quick examples. Dreyfus Affair, late 19th century. A member of the Epstein class stood accused, and there were socialists who supported abrogating his rights, I think, to a fair trial or defense, something like this. It's been a long time since I've looked at the history. But along with Jean Jaurès, Debs very clearly critiqued that. Now, Debs could have said, anti-Semitism is part of French culture, and clearly we can make great gains with the people if only we throw our support behind this. But he didn't at all. Second example, from my memory, he's critical of the Bolsheviks' execution of the socialist revolutionaries, though I believe he also indicates that he comes to also indicate that certain things might be necessary in time of a war or revolution, but nonetheless he signals criticism. He could have said, well, this is just, Russian ruthlessness and barbarism, right? He doesn't. He thinks about it on the grounds of politics, but these kinds of national, cultural, inherent qualities, do not arise in his analysis of that situation. Third case, U.S. South. One could easily say, well, segregation, this is just part of the regional culture. Maybe even there's a black belt nation that would justify, this kind of racism and segregation. Debs never even remotely approaches that logic ever, right? But hey, why not? If you have a national, cultural, national sort of distinct separatism, distinct roads and paths to politics, right? So down the line, as far as I know, again, Debs is always sort of upholding these bourgeois revolutionary rights and principles. I'll end it there.
Give our panel speakers.